کردم همه اون دوستانی که ترجیح میدن به فارسی براشون ترجمه بشه که دکتر رامین پرهام تقبل کردن ترجمه بکنن، یه جایی بنشینن که صدای دکتر پرهام رو بشنون به انگلیسی. پس با عزتون جلسه رو به انگلیسی شروع می‌کنم. Thank you very much, Mr. Fitzpatrick, Mr. Zade, Mr. Otolenghi, Mr. Biat, for being with us today. As our morning session shows, there is no issue as important as the nuclear talks, the nuclear problem with Iran for the Iranian people, one that not only could possibly result in a war with adversaries 100 times stronger than Iran's adversary in the Iran-Iraq war. But even without that, it's already being felt at every dinner table in Iran because of sanctions, and it promises to become probably one of the most devastating blows to the Iranian economy since World War II. We thank you for being with us to shed light with the respect that the international community has for your expertise, your knowledge of the nuclear problem. I will not introduce any of you. I'm not qualified. You're much more qualified. So please have an introductory remark about yourself, and then 10 minutes for a presentation. We'll take turns, after which we'll return to questions and answers, allocating a lot of time because I'm sure the audience is very interested in asking questions, putting questions to you. I will only say a few words about the man who's not physically here but will be with us on the phone from Sweden, Hans Blix. Hans Blix is a former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency. He was in charge of the United Nations Committee on Weapons of Mass Destruction, and with the intellectual courage to stand up against a very, very honest US Secretary of State, one who was known not to like war, and yet sat there to convince the United Nations that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And he had the courage of his convictions and stood up to that. And in one of those only cases that you could prove that something doesn't exist, he was right. It probably couldn't have been proven any other way than actually going into Iraq and searching every corner, but he was right. So it'll be our pleasure. Hans Blix has written his latest series of suggestions on the nuclear crisis. We will have copies of his statement distributed, but you can also go to blixassociates.com. It's the first article you see there. And he will, luck helping, we're trying to reach him by Skype in his country home in Sweden. He said he'd be with us from 2 to 4, and he will make 5 to 10 minute introductory remark about these proposed solutions. So without further ado, Mark Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. I'm Mark Fitzpatrick, Director of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Prior to going to London 6.5 years ago, I was a U.S. diplomat for 26 years, during which time I covered the Iranian nuclear program intensively. I think it's entirely appropriate that this meeting focus one of its panels on the nuclear program, which is increasingly serious. And I personally would like to express sympathy to the citizens of Iran and their relatives who are paying a heavy price for policies that I believe are unnecessary and unwise. The policy is to be able to produce a nuclear weapon as soon as possible when a political decision is made to do it. There's no evidence that Iran has made a decision to produce a nuclear weapon, but they clearly want to be able to do so once a decision is made. There are civilian aspects to the nuclear program, of course. Bushehr is for the purpose of nuclear power, and nobody opposes that purpose. Nobody opposes the Bushehr nuclear reactor. But Iran acknowledges that a main purpose of its nuclear program is a strategic purpose, to have a nuclear hedge. And even if Iran does not go the full step of producing a nuclear weapon, this policy could lead to war in the near future. So I think the situation is very, very serious. And I don't want ever to exaggerate the facts, but nor to underestimate them, not to ignore them. So let's review the basic facts about Iran's nuclear program. Iran to date has produced enough low-enriched uranium for about 4 or maybe more nuclear weapons if it is further enriched. Iran does not need this enriched uranium for any civilian purpose today, because all of the enriched uranium fuel for Iran's only reactor at Bushehr is provided by Russia, and Russia has agreed to provide the fuel for the lifetime of the reactor. Iran says it needs to produce enriched uranium for some future reactor which Iran might build on its own. I'll tell you, if Iran ever builds a nuclear power plant on its own, it will be tremendously unsafe. It will be an environmental and a safety hazard to anyone living in the vicinity. This is a problem for the Iranian citizenry, but it's also a problem for Iran's Gulf neighbors. Iran's stockpile of low-enriched uranium is growing rapidly. It's growing 60% more each month today than it was a year ago. And increasingly, Iran's emphasis is on producing 20% enriched uranium. Since November, Iran has quadrupled the number of centrifuges used to produce 20% enriched uranium. Most of this work is being done at the underground facility at Fordo. Western media reports always say near Qom, because people know Qom. And I think it's unfortunate that Qom has become associated globally with Iran's nuclear program, not with its religious center. In the same way that Esfahan has become known throughout the world for uranium conversion, not a center of education and religion. The 20% enriched uranium that Iran has produced to date is enough to fuel the Tehran research reactor for over 10 years if Iran were able to produce fuel safely. Iran in January said that they produced fuel but by my analysis, it is not safer to use. It's another environmental and safety threat to the people living near the Tehran research reactor. Efforts have been undertaken to try to limit Iran's nuclear program through industrial sabotage, through computer attacks, Stuxnet, and by other means. None of these means have stopped Iran's program or even slowed it. At most, they've slowed Iran's attainment of its goals. In last November, the International Atomic Energy Agency detailed the ways in which Iran had also worked on weaponization. For a nuclear weapon, you need to have fissile material, and then you need the various technologies to put the fissile material into a weapon that can be imploded and exploded. And there's evidence that Iran worked on the entire range of weaponization technologies. Now, it's not clear how far this weaponization work advanced before Iran suspended most of the work on that weaponization in 2003. Some of that work continued after 2003, but apparently most of it was suspended. But nobody knows how far it got or why exactly it was suspended. And without knowing how far it got, it's impossible to say how quickly Iran could produce a nuclear weapon. Iran could produce the highly enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon in 4 to 6 months. But then they probably need another 6 months to weaponize these other technologies. But maybe less. Some American analysts believe that Iran already did all of the weaponization work and that Iran would very quickly be able to produce a nuclear weapon. I have debated with these American analysts. I think that it would be about a year, and I believe Iran would not be so foolhardy as to produce just one nuclear weapon. They would need to produce a handful, maybe 4, because one might not work. They want one for retaliation. They might want to test one. So about 4 they would need. So it takes a couple of years, maybe. So there's still time for diplomacy. Iran won't be producing a nuclear weapon this year or next year. But the diplomacy, as you know, is not going very well. The talks this summer have been focused on confidence-building measures. Not focused on a solution, but just some initial steps to build confidence. Iran's negotiating partners have asked for 3 things. Stop the production of 20% enriched uranium, stop the work at Fordo, and export the accumulated 20% enrichment. This will not solve the problem because Iran still has 4 weapons worth of lower enriched uranium. But at least it would give some breathing space. Because one of Iran's neighbors, Israel, is very, very concerned about the 20% enriched uranium and might take military action this year. I believe if diplomacy does not achieve some results this summer, that the chances of a military attack against Iran's nuclear facilities in September or October will be about 50%. I'm not happy about that. I don't advocate it. I think it would be a huge mistake. But as an analyst, I think Israel will do it if there's no progress. One of the key issues in the negotiations is about the so-called right to enrichment. The negotiating partners, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, China, have already told Iran that when their program is proven to be for entirely peaceful purposes, then enrichment would be acceptable. But it's not proven today, and all of the facts today indicate that the purpose is for a military purpose. So there's no logic for Iran's negotiating partners to give a right to enrichment when they believe the purpose of the enrichment is for building this nuclear hedge for weapons. Iran says in the negotiations there should be no preconditions. On the other hand, it wants a right to enrichment as a precondition. I think the right to enrichment could be part of the negotiation. As a former diplomat, I know how words could be sliced and with some conditions, and it could be expressed in a way to meet Iran's bottom line, if what they want is simply the right. But if they want an unfettered right to produce fissile material for a nuclear weapon, they won't get that right. And it's not just because of American politics in an election year that President Obama cannot give the right to enrichment as a upfront offer. All of Iran's European negotiating partners hold to the same position, and France particularly. So I know some people think the United States political situation is preventing the progress in the talks. I think Iran's political position is preventing the progress in the talks. But if Iran wants to make progress, I think there is a way to find a solution to deal with the right to enrichment and to take the confidence building measures that could dissuade Israel from attacking this year. And I'm hoping and praying that we can find the wisdom to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Do we have a telephone connection with Dr. Hans Bلیکس? Can Dr. Bلیکس hear us? Could you ask him? Can he hear us?
Not yet. Not yet. Yes.
Okay, would you please, dear Reza, could you raise your hand when you're in communication with Dr. Bلیکس and also ask him when he would like to start his 5-minute statement so that we adjust accordingly. Thank you. Have a great pleasure of introducing Mr. Patarik.
I think Reza has raised his hand. I don't know if Dr. Bلیکس is ready to talk or not. No? No? I saw his finger.
No, he wasn't.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Fortunately, from your point of view, I haven't prepared any long speech, so I thought, taking part in this panel, I would have a pleasure to debate part of Dr. Bلیکس's views and also maybe having a discussion with Mark, and you would be second-hand beneficiary of the talk, but I'm going to say. I think I would like to make a little reference to the history of these dinosaurs, the so-called Iran nuclear program, and going through a couple of metamorphoses that it went in the course of the last 20 years. To my mind, when they have started this program and as a mission, they sent at the time the foreign minister, Mr. Biat, to Pakistan to bring over some of the old-fashioned gas centrifuges called P1. The reason was to strike a balance against Iran. At the time, Saddam Hussein, deeply involved in war with Iran, was pursuing the same. Osiyak nuclear power station.
Could you please get closer to the microphone because we have...
Or getting microphone.
Oh, yes, now it's getting better.
And maybe Mr. Sazgara can make a comment about it because Sepah Pastaran, there are documents out to suggest that they get to know about the Iraq's intention to get hand on a nuclear program, and they wanted to do the same, simply because they wanted to strike a balance in the region. And if they would have other means of mass destruction, including chemical weapons, Iran would have done exactly the same. On the second phase of this program, I think the intention by Iranian side was to have a deterrent, and that made this program more complicated. And at the time, getting hand on fuel cycle was one of the ways by which they could camouflage the real two primary intentions. Iran, beside this so-called civilian nuclear program, took two different ways of approaching the nuclear bomb, in fact. One to go through plutonium production, having a reactor of the 40 up to 45 megawatt capacity, and also going through achieving the nuclear fuel cycle and getting uranium-based bomb. And to cover all these, of course, they believed that they could go through the civilian program, and they had two different sites made in Iraq and Isfahan, and both allegedly disclosed by Mujahideen Khalq, and they were forced to pursue the policy of openness and to say, yes, we are open about it, we don't have anything to hide, and these are all pure civilian programs. But almost 25 years since, Iran is yet to prove that it has the capacity and the real intention to go through the civilian side of the program. Mark mentioned a couple of obstacles. One of them would be, although they have increased the capacity of uranium enrichment, and although they have completed the fuel cycle, but if with the rate of last 8 years, they carry on producing uranium, at the end of only 35 years, they could manage to produce enough fuel to feed one reactor at the size of Bushehr. And we do know all that Russia promised to provide Iran with fuel, and the international community are more than happy to provide Iran with nuclear fuel if demanded. And also, regardless of the safety hazard that Mark again made a reference to, is Iran's capacity and the timetable needed to create one reactor at the size of Bushehr. It takes 10 years. And the rational question is, if you have 10 years to make one nuclear reactor with all these costs, why on earth are not going after gas burn electricity production plant, which takes between 1.5 years up to 2 years maximum with the same capacity and half a price and all natural resources inside Iran? Who can explain this? This is one of the indicators that Iran genuinely is not going through civilian program, and the final intention is something different. So the entire world has become suspicious of the final intention. To my mind, cut the long talk a little bit shorter if possible. To my mind, I think the Islamic Republic has made one of the most complicated mistakes of its history strategically, with having a nuclear program intertwined with the security of its own. I think this program started one phase after they decided to have a deterrence, when they realized with Shahab missile, practically they cannot have a deterrence. If this giant would fly, if it is not being intercepted and managed to go through 3 different phases of anti-missile systems, could only carry on 750 kilos of whatever the explosive would be. And what could it do? Regardless of the inaccuracy of the missile, it could cause damages to 2-3 buildings. Does it mean a deterrent? Does it mean any safety for the country? Of course not. And Iran at the time was denied practically to have access to modern weapon systems. And the only mean by which they had in hand was the missiles to defend themselves. And they thought if they arm these with nuclear bomb without saying it, at least they can create that deterrence within the country, and then let's see what would happen next. But in 2003, they have made this decision to ask American to offer them with security, and that was the time they practically intertwined the fate of their nuclear program with the future of their own, with the security of their own. At this juncture, the government is not decided whether the fate of the system would go the same way as the fate of Iranian nuclear program, and inclination is not decided yet. It's in a very, very murky area. The nation decided that they don't want to put their own national security online because of this program. One of the guys this morning mentioned about the polling that canvassed opinion of some of the people in Iran, and the results were on the line for a couple of hours, and 90% said they are against closure of Hormuz, Strait of Hormuz, and more than 75% agreed to abandon nuclear enrichment. So it means clear majority of the nation divided their way with, because of the national security and of course economic benefits from the fate of the nuclear program, but the government still is struggling and trying to haggle over a couple of points that came to the light only 2 years ago. And they try to pretend that the main issue is not nuclear enrichment. The main issue is not Iran's capacity to produce bomb. They just say we are ready to cut a deal with you, and they are haggling over 20% enriched uranium of 150 kilograms, or closure of Fordo or not. I think this strategic mistake would prove very, very costly for them. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Tariq. One might add thousands of billions of cubic feet of gas being lost because Iran doesn't have normal relations with those who could provide the technology to develop the gas fields, while Qatar is going kilometers in and kilometers horizontal and reaching the gas fields and getting them out. And that would forever reduce the pressure in the gas fields of Iran. So that's added to the questions of why Iran is doing this. Emmanuel, اتولنگی, please.
Thank you, and thanks to the organizers for giving me this platform today in the company of such a distinguished panel. I want to thank you also for the remark you made. Perhaps the best argument you could make, even probably with Iranians, about why they should seek a deal is that every day that you don't have a deal, you're enriching the Qataris. So that might be a persuasive way to make the case. I have chosen to address an issue which is not exactly and entirely connected, or it's not the core question of the nuclear file, but it's intimately linked to it, and it's the question of sanctions. I am a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is a Washington-based think tank, part of the vast global neocon right-wing conspiracy to bring down every single dictatorship in the world. I'm proud of being part of this outfit, and having lived and worked in Brussels for the last 6 years, my brief has been to work on the sanction side of the nuclear file. And I want to speak about sanctions for a few minutes, because the negotiations over the nuclear program with Iran began here in Europe on the initiative of 3 European powers, who at the time probably sought to create a mechanism of dialogue and diplomacy which would avoid the Iranian file developing in the same direction that the Iraqi file developed. Remember that the dialogue began in 2003, right at the time when the Iraq war was underway. Now, the intention was to use diplomacy to find a solution. One of the biggest obstacles was the lack of participation in these initial stages of diplomacy by the great powers. And so eventually in 2006, the mechanism was expanded to include the United States. And diplomats here in Brussels routinely said, our Iranian counterparts tell us, unless the United States is part of this dialogue, we're not interested. It's not a serious task. So the United States joined, and that's how we got the mechanism of the P5+1, what here in Brussels we like to call EU 3+3. And the basic approach of this mechanism is twin track, as the European diplomats say, namely dialogue and engagement with the regime over its nuclear program, combined with strong incentives in order to achieve a compromise, but at the same time, in parallel, gradually increasing pressure all the time that this agreement fails to come to fruition. And this is where the sanctions begin. Now, interestingly, for many years, the European Union said, this was the official position of the Union, our goal is to change the behavior of the regime over the nuclear file. We do not want to change the regime, we do not want to undermine the regime, especially after the Iraq war and Saddam Hussein. Regime change became a dirty word in this town. So we want to change the behavior. We believe that the right balance of incentives and pressures will convince the leaders of Iran to change behavior. And most importantly, we do not want to repeat the mistakes of the Iraqi sanctions, which ended up harming the people rather than the regime. And so officials would routinely say that the regime is involved in the production of everything, going from diapers to missiles. And we want to harm the missiles program, but not the diapers program. Okay, so the idea was we only go after proliferation. And if you look at the history of sanctions against Iran, you see that up until 2010, more or less, sanctions strictly focused on proliferation efforts from the regime. Every time the European Union, the United States, other members of the Security Council, members of the IAEA were able to identify companies and individuals inside the regime involved in procuring technology for either the nuclear program or the missile program, those individuals and those companies would go on the list of sanctioned entities. Resolution 1737 was the beginning of that, then came Resolution 1747 and Resolution 1803. And that principle has remained to this day. However, since June 2010, and I think that a significant component of this change is, or some significant factor for this change was the June 2009 elections and the ensuing repression of Iranian protesters by the regime, combined with the failure of the October-November 2009 talks over the uranium transfer deal proposed initially by Russia, France, and the United States, convinced the European Union to expand sanctions dramatically. And the second stage was to go after 3 pillars of the regime's effort to build nuclear weapons. One, procurement. Every company involved in buying technology overseas that could have a link to the nuclear missile program was targeted. 2, every company that was involved in transporting, moving about technology was targeted, so sanctions against the shipping companies and sanctions against the airlines. And 3, sanction against financing. It's not enough to have companies that procure and ships that transport, you also need cash to pay. So these were the 3 pillars. And in addition to that, there was a begrudging agreement here in Brussels that it was time to go also after the main sources of revenue of the regime. So the 2010 sanctions began going after the natural gas sector, and the latest round of sanctions recently approved has, of course, introduced the oil embargo and sanctions and restrictions on the petrochemical industry. Now, these are the most important exports that Iran has towards the European Union, and so they're extremely significant. What are the problems with the sanctions and what are the advantages? The advantages are that the sanctions have persuaded those members of the European Union who did not want to do anything else about dialogue, that unless you did sanctions, someone else would bomb Iran. In other words, they were chosen here as a preferred avenue and alternative to military action undertaken by someone else. And so it was possible to persuade reluctant members of the European Union, and also to some extent of the international community, that if you did sanctions, you could obtain a compromise and avoid military confrontation. So that's an important advantage. The second advantage is that sanctions are part of a broad approach. We made mistakes on sanctions with Iraq because we had nothing else but sanctions. But when it comes to Iran, we have dialogue, we have sanctions, and yes, there is a military option, which in my view helps actually diplomacy, because as long as it is credible, it helps as an instrument of pressure to negotiate and reach a compromise. Now, what are the problems? The problem is that there is a continuing perception that the regime will do a cost and benefit analysis that ultimately will lead to the regime giving up the ambition for nuclear weapons. We will be able to reach a compromise, and we should make it abundantly clear to the regime that that's our goal, not to support the internal opposition. And this I've heard countless times here in Brussels from people who say, we need to tell the Iranian rulers that we do not want to undermine their power, that we do not want to support opposition, which is why the support for opposition in Iran in June, July 2009, especially in the United States, was very hesitant, because the perception was it would jeopardize negotiations. And I think that that's a very big mistake. It's a big mistake, although I understand the concerns and the objections. People say, you know, look at what happened in 2009. That may have been the best hope for toppling this regime. It didn't work. The regime is firmly in control. The security services, the Pasdaran, everybody else is very loyal to the regime. Even though there may be a majority against it, the revolution has failed. There is no chance. The regime is firmly in control. And to this I answer, if you asked me or any of the gentlemen on this panel in November 2010, what is the stablest regime in the Middle East? The answer would have been, I think, by consensus, Tunisia. Tunisia is the stablest regime in the Middle East, the one that controls the country best, that has a strong middle class. They have, moderate Islam. They have this, they have that. They're Europeanized. They have ties to the West. They're relatively, yes, it's a totalitarian government. Yes, it's corrupt, but they live better off than everybody else in the Middle East, etc., etc., etc. A month later, a fruit seller sets himself on fire in a forgotten little town in the south of the country, and the rest is history. So I think that in our strategy dealing with the Iranian regime, we have forgotten the most important, potentially most important player in this game, which is the Iranian people. We have forgotten that in the past we negotiated over nuclear issues and arms reduction with much bigger enemies and adversaries, the Soviet Union, for example. And we were able at the same time to engage in diplomatic relations, negotiate, trade, and support human rights. And I think that here there is something missing in our strategy, that we have not done enough at the same time that we're sitting with the regime in Baghdad, in Istanbul, and so on, to also talk directly to the Iranian people. It may be that the regime is stable and in control, but it may also be that something unpredictable happens tomorrow which will change the face of the country dramatically. And we should not be seen to be cozy with the regime when that happens. Again, part of the reason why that may be more likely today than in the past is because of the sanctions. I don't need to tell you the hyperinflation, the difficulties in moving money around. There are thousands of stories, anecdotes, statistical evidence of how difficult things are inside the country. And I find it very, very bizarre that the Iranian people would tolerate this so much longer and remain loyal to the regime instead. So I think that our strategy should also incorporate something that has to do with human rights. We have the evidence of terrible violations of human rights and atrocities. We know the names of the dissidents who are in jail. We know the things that are happening inside the country. And we have tools, while we continue to negotiate, to promote a tougher approach that holds this regime to account. I hope, at least on this issue, that there is a consensus in this room, and I'm happy to elaborate in the Q&A period if there is interest on details. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Otolenghi. I have the pleasure of giving the microphone to our dear friend, Mr. Biat.
Good afternoon.
A couple of introductory remarks.
My name is Behrouz Biat. I'm a physicist, working at universities in the industry, and recently the last 10 years I had some cooperation. Closer to? Okay. I had also, as an external expert, some cooperation with International Atomic Energy Agency. I was always interested in this issue, in the issue of nuclear policy of Iran, in the old regime, and it's continuing now, and so that's why I'm sitting here. At first, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for the invitation to come here. My sole intention to be present here was the participation on this distinguished panel, and I hope we will have an exciting exchange of information. Actually, my approach to the whole problem, to the nuclear issue of Iran, has two main aspects. One is why, or let's say, let's go a bit in the history, why the regime has started with that program. It was mentioned by Mr. Zade. I don't want to repeat it, but we know that it was born in a time when, during the war, during the Iran-Iraq war, when Iran was attacked via chemical weapons, and the regime was seeking for a possibility to build a counter weaponry against it. It was done clandestinely, as we know, and it was discovered. And I think what is definitely fact is that the regime started with the program in order to produce a nuclear weapon. But I think after the discovery of that program, after it was revealed, I think that even if the regime would like to do so, it doesn't have the possibility. I think it has changed from producing a nuclear weapon to getting the capability of producing nuclear weapon. I think it was a consensus in the why the regime needed at the beginning. As I told you, they wanted to have a nuclear weapon as a mean of deterrence, and I think it is continuing to be the main intention of the regime, to have an deterrence means, first of all. But after some time, it has changed a bit the character. For example, the regime maintains somehow ambiguity, as we know. Sometimes they exaggerate in what they can. You know, they exaggerate. It means they would like to get somehow not clear situation, a little ambiguity, in order because they consider the whole nuclear issue as a strategic asset. Whether they produce nuclear weapon or not, it is considered as a strategic asset. So now we don't know the persistence of the regime in this case, whether it is motivated by maintaining the tension because of the ideological background, or they would like to get more concessions from the West. It is really not clear what is the main intention. But another point has been added to the problem, and it is the face-saving aspect, because the regime has done a lot of propaganda, he has invested a lot of capitals, a lot of money in the whole problem. You know that, it is familiar, you are all familiar with that case. And I think it is also a face-saving issue for the regime to continue with that program. But anyway, not to give it up easily. So from the point of view whether the program is beneficial for the country, you can answer it definitely no, it is not beneficial. Even in the best cases, even if we wouldn't have any problem, any political problem with the war, the nuclear issue for Iran, also the civil part of nuclear issue also, is not beneficial for Iran. Because, as we know, the country has many sources. I mean, for example, the energetic value of nuclear resources of Iran is less than 0.1% of energetic value of Iran natural gases, for example, to tell you an example. It means there is no sense for that, and that is why the world has doubts about the real intention of the regime. Now, for example, the issue of enrichment, for example, that absolutely has no sense, because you can never produce uranium, enriched uranium, just for one reactor, or even for 5 reactors, you know. Because if you don't have a mass production, you cannot produce beneficially. So it means from that point of view, from the beneficial point of view, it has no sense for Iran. From the security point of view, I would say it's the same. It means, let's say, if Iran, for them in the best case, for us in the worst case, if Iran would be able, if the regime would be able to produce some nuclear bombs, it doesn't bring security for the country, as we see that in everyday news from Pakistan. We know how the situation in Pakistan is from the economical point of view, and we see how the security situation is, and how that it is no deterrence, for example, that Americans intervene wherever they would like in Pakistan. So it is not. But the most important, the most important aspect is that in case that Iran would succeed to get nuclear bombs, then we would have the problem of race, of a nuclear weapon race in the Middle East. It is, at first, it is devastating for all the economies involved, first of all. And secondly, it will prevent the countries to come closer to each other. We should look a little in the future. We should consider that it is not possible to coexist in the Middle East by having more weapons, more guns, more tanks, more warplanes, and more bombs, and possibly nuclear bombs. That is not the way for the future. The way for the future is to intensify the cooperation and to build the security up on the cooperation as it has been done in the Middle East, in Europe. Yeah? So I think. 2 minutes, okay. And now another point is, my concern is whether the nuclear program of Iran is a casus belli. I mean, in the worst case, is a casus belli. My answer is definitely no. I think the Iranian regime as well as the West exaggerate in creating an imminent danger for Israel or for the world or whatever. I think that is exaggeration. The regime would like to exaggerate because the regime would like to get to maintain the ambiguity. So maybe somehow imitating Israel to maintain this ambiguity. So I think the only reason why the regime in Iran could be an imminent danger for Israel or for the West is if you assume there is an apocalyptic government. And that is definitely not the case. The regime in Iran has a profane behavior. If you look at the corruption, if you look at the looting and plundering and of the resources of the country, they don't do that for the day after. No, they do that for this world, and they are not people who are going to commit suicide because in case they would attack Israel. What is my conclusion of that, what I'm telling? I think the West should let's say take the military threat off the table, because if the sanctions are going on, if the sanctions are not successful, if the regime doesn't bend and the sanctions goes further, then what would be the exit strategy? I will be finished there. What would be the exit strategy? The only exit strategy which remains, unfortunately, would be a war. If the sanctions are increased, and sometimes the regime continues as Saddam did in Iraq, then there is no exit strategy. That is why I think the world should consider Iran as a dynamic society. The regime is not, the system is not static. The system is changing. Iran society is a very dynamic society, it's a very diverse society, very educated society, and they will change the situation. The West should invest on helping the people to change the society in order to bring a sustainable solution for the nuclear issue as well. Because if we proceed like this, it is a cat and mouse play in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, it's such a distinguished panel with so much knowledge about the nuclear issue, it becomes the privilege of the moderator to ask the village idiot's question. Does the Islamic Republic want a solution? Because if it doesn't, then what's the point in negotiations? Could it be that what the Islamic Republic wants is to see for the first time since the glory days of the Ottoman Empire, there is an Islamic state sitting on one side of the table and 5+1, the awesome power of the world arrayed on the other, and forget about substance, it's the theater that counts, and that's what they're after. Suppose they want a deterrence regime, because it would deter not only nuclear weapons of the other side, but also high-intensity conventional violence, and so theater of possible action falls to low-intensity warfare, where Iran has built a massive superiority throughout the region from the Mediterranean to the gates of India for the last 30 years. So the moment they're perceived as nuclear military superiority, in the usable sense, passes from the West to Iran. Suppose it's another value, purely internal, that if they resolve the solution and have normal relations with the rest of the world, there will be an internal shift of power from hardliners to those who speak the language of the West better. And the base of power of the regime right now is the hardliners, and they don't want it. So then the question often asked in halls of decision makers in the US Congress, are these people rational? Becomes nonsense, because they may be rational, but optimizing for a value very different from what you think. Or the question of, we deter the Russians, why can't we deter Iran, becomes irrelevant, because their deterrent served you and neutralized the numerical superiority of conventional military in the Soviet Union. But here it'll hurt you, because you'll be the loser in the deterrence system. They can calibrate the weapons of Hezbollah 20% more range for the rocket. What's your response under a deterrence regime? So I hope that as we open the questions, the distinguished panel will think about the village idiot's very unconventional questions. We will go for the next 40 minutes for questions and discussion. At which time, hopefully this time, we will have Dr. Hans Bلیکس, and then we will continue discussions based on what he says afterwards. Please raise your hands. Mr. Asadi, Ms. Tawakkol, Ms. Zarkesh, Dr. Zade, Ms. Nahid Hosseini, Mr. Nasser Holiday, Mr. Mahsoudnia, Mr. Salimi, Nushabe Amiri, Dr. Sazagara, Mr. Hossein Bor, and Mr. Shahriar. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. If we could keep the questions to one maximum 1.5 minutes, that will leave enough time for the panel to respond. Mr. Asad.
Thank you very much. That was really a privilege to have all these gentlemen in this panel on a very strategic issue for my country, now for the war. I don't have any specific questions, but
could you please speak a bit louder, or microphone, turn on the microphone, yes. And could you please restart,
That's fine. Okay. I don't have any specific questions, but I have 4 points raised by your talks, gentlemen, and I would like to have your reactions on them. Number 1 is cost and benefit analysis. I really think that Islamic Republic does have a cost-benefit analysis. If we misunderstand and if we are a stranger to their cost and benefit analysis because they are having different definitions of cost and benefit analysis, this is highly important to consider. Unemployment, inflation, misery, and declining oil productions are not costs for them. But the benefit, they consider the potential of nuclear arm as the greatest benefit they might have. So I think this is very important to consider while negotiating with them. Number 2, I think this is very wise not to support opposition, at least in a manifest way, during these negotiations. However, putting the item of human rights as part of the negotiation is highly important. Highly important, because if I don't have time, I don't know, but I think I won't have. If they don't have bomb, they would bother the world in other ways. As long as there is not a democratic, human right-based government in Iran, you're going to have the same problems. Probably not in an atomic dimension, by all means, kind of measures. My last point is that I think the strategy, Dr. Banger talked about nuclear as a strategic asset. I think the strategy of the hardliners, not all of them, but the hardliners in the Islamic Republic, is to create a new Cold War, in which peace is not possible, war is not possible. However, they want the international community to consider them as a partner, if not for common projects, because they cannot have common projects, because they are having their own values which are different, but they want to be considered as kind of a Soviet partner in, during the Cold War. I think that one again is very, very highly important. I would appreciate if I can have your reactions on these different points. Just a very last example, this time I'm not that much, I don't agree that much with my friend Dr. Biat about Pakistan. I think Pakistan, in a sense, has succeeded to have a kind of Cold War with the West. We are having bomb, even we support and we host Al-Qaeda, don't bother us, we don't have any interest in that.
Ms. Zarkesh.
My question is about the sanction. You said you are not going for the regime change, which I agree. You know, the foreigners should not actually tackle this one. This is to do with Iranian people. But at the other hand, where do you think the solution is? If it goes on and on, the sanction goes on and on, and at the end of the day, if the Iranian regime will not cooperate with the world, then where are we going to end up? The sanction is already affecting the lives of Iranian people. The government will not cooperate. Then what? I mean, this is a big question. Where are we going to end up? We don't want the military attack like what it happened in Iraq. But where are we going to attack? You said we don't want, because of the government will not negotiate, then will not support the opposition. But whereas, also for most of us here, sitting here, we agree with the the support of the democratic governments of the world in order to be able to do something ourselves in Iran. I'm not a spokesperson for them in Iran, but I can't see any solution the way the world is going towards Iran. I don't know what the solution is. Can please the panel answer what we want to achieve?
Ms. Tabakat.
I asked this question or had this comment earlier in Farsi. I'm very stubborn, so I'll have it again, or I'll ask it again, or say it again. I think it's widely underestimated what big issue it would be for the regime if we politically, from the West, sanctioned it more and diplomatically, so that we could have consuls in the, for instance, in the European Union countries and not embassies. Because I believe that the regime's identity is based on exporting its revolutionary ideas to the rest of the world, to the South America, to even in Denmark or other European countries. They think about Denmark as or Copenhagen as the first country. I think it was one person from the regime said that in 2025 Denmark would be the first capital in Europe or in the West that had more Muslims than non-Muslims. So I think also because of the fact that economic sanctions will also affect the people, why not do more political and diplomatic sanctions?
Dr. Baraza.
Thank you. Thank you for the distinguished panel for their valuable contribution. Just a question to Mark. You mentioned that if these negotiations don't progress, the Israelis may attack Iran sometime September to November. First question is that what does progress mean here? What they want to see as progress so that it happens or that it will happen. And do you think that they could attack in September before the election in the States? And if they do, what do you think the reaction of the American government before the election or after the election would be? And the question to Mr. Lange, of course, there were questions about economic sanctions against the regime which harm the Iranian people, which goes against the initial criteria that sanctions should not harm people and should only harm the how do they sort of rectify this or how to qualify this? And the question about, you said that military option should be there because it helps diplomacy. What is the evidence for that? Do we have the evidence that actually helps diplomacy? Has it helped so far? Thank you.
Ms. Nahid Hosseini.
Thank you. Actually, my question goes to
Nahid.
My question goes to Mr. Bayat. You gave some reasons which clearly show that Iran is not capable of producing nuclear weapons. And also, the other hand, Western countries make exaggeration of it. My question is, so what's the point of having meetings and negotiations for something which we are not quite sure about?
Mr. Nasser Walidei.
Thank you very much. The my question was, first question was Mr. اتولنگی about
we can't hear you.
About human rights. About human rights, because in the Soviet era you said that the West combined negotiation with human rights, but with Iran sometimes it's try to avoid that. Is it because of the Iranian government's character, or is it because of Iranian people's character, or is the West policy towards Iran is just for a period, just this discussion with Iran about nuclear power, over and this change of behavior? It is not like Soviet winning or losing. And in some cases, well, as an Iranian, sometimes you would think that maybe West care less about the human rights of the people in the Middle East, and it would not be the first time, since we were betrayed also after the First World War and also the situation that came in the Middle East. So it is, I think, a question that should be asked. I also, in my meetings, sometimes I have the European and the American politician. I ask this question all the time, but never get answer. I hope there will be clarification. And my another question was to Mr. Biat about Iran government, because always the Iran, when the Iran discussion come up, if Iran wants military capability, they say it hasn't made a decision. The question is, has it made the decision not to produce a nuclear weapon? How you say that it has been sitting down and they have a protocol, and they say, well, we never had made a decision. Because Iran is not a country, I think, well, in the European Parliament or somewhere else that they have made this decision, and it's like that. And even I think it was Mr. Clinton also used the fatwa, Khamenei's fatwa. As we know, the fatwa of Khamenei could be broken from another mullah or Khatami himself. As long as he lives, he can change his fatwa. So I think in political sense, it is very, I think, naive to use fatwa. I was surprised to hear that the Western countries also use this Khamenei's fatwa which for me. And that was all my question. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you for being here. My name is Onnogolries from the Netherlands. I would like to ask a question from the gentleman from the left side. I forgot your name. Sorry. Yes.
My name.
Yes.
The right side.
Yeah. I wanted to say Mr. Neocon, but I prefer to say Mr. from the left side. My question is about a lecture, I think, Mr. Hossein Mousavian, the previous ambassador of Iran in Germany, and one of the highest diplomats in the nuclear talks, had in April about the nuclear problem of Iran. It was before this, the meetings in Istanbul and in Iraq. And he said the main concern, he said Mr. Khamenei is the highest person in Iran who decides about this issue, nuclear problem, nuclear issue. And he said the main concern of Mr. Khamenei is to have insurance about the future of the regime. And if the West gives us insurance, he could come with a solution, let's say a compromise with the West. I think you referred in your time about this issue very shortly, but would you just explain more, maybe the other gentlemen also, about why the West is not willing to give this insurance to Mr. Khamenei if it's Mr. Mousavian speaking the truth about the whole idea? Thank you.
Dr. Payam, would you please now translate Mr. Mahsoudnian and Mr. Salimian next?
Yes.
نقش روسی در ایران با توجه به اینکه جمهوری اسلامی اگر به صورت اصلی مجهز بشه استراتژی سیاسی منطقه تغییر و روسیه به عنوان متحد اصلی بین‌المللی ایران و حضورش در حدود 5 چه نقشی داره؟ نقش مثبتی داره در مذاکرات با روسیه و نقش منفی داره و خصوصا بقیه اعضای 5 چه سیاست‌هایی می‌خوان اتخاذ بکنن که بتونن اگر نقش منفی روسیه داره این نقش منفی روسیه رو
Mr. Masudnia's question is related to the role of Russia within, as a power, and the role of Russia within the 5+1 committee. That is, if Iran accedes to nuclear weapons, that will completely change the strategic scheme of the region. That will also affect Russia. Will this be in the benefit of Russia or not? And what does the rest of the P5+1 plans to do if Russia does not play a positive role with regard to Iran? Because since Mr. Masudnia says Russia being the only major ally of the Iranian regime, what does the rest of the P5+1 intend to do in order to counter any negative role that Russia could play in this world?
And next, Mr. Salimi.
Yes.
باز در مورد روسیه گفته بشه که ادامه این بحث، یعنی عدم سازش با غرب آیا به نفع روسیه نیست؟ آیا روسیه خواهان این نیست که نه جنگی صورت بگیره نه صلحی، ولی همینجوری برنامه از ایران پیش داده بشه چون موندن ایران در زیر جیوب روسیه به این مسئله بستگی زیادی داره و اگر رابطه غرب با ایران درست بشه روسیه دسترسیش با پای گرد دوباره قطع میشه. یکیش اینه دومی خیلی مهمه، اینا که دنبال آدم‌های جمهوری اسلامی هستن لطفا یکیش همین حسین موسویانه که طرح ترور میکنوس در سفارت جمهوری اسلامی در مورد پرسش و چرا با این آدم الان رفته صاحب بورس شده، جایزه هم گرفته.
So two parts in this question. First part pertains to Russia again. The question is, how do you think that the status quo will benefit Russia actually? That Russia is the main beneficiary of the continuation of the situation as it is, that is the status quo. Because that would maintain Iran outside the sphere of influence of the West. And the second part of the question is related to the West and to you, about the 5+1 and Western countries. Is that you talk about Musavian, who was the former ambassador in Germany of the Islamic Republic. According to our friends here, Mr. Musavian was directly involved in the Mykonos assassination plot. Who are these people who are advising you on these issues that you said you are under pressure from many sides, not to talk about regimes and everything? Is it Mr. Musavian, and how can you possibly sit down with a person who has been directly involved in an assassination?
I have a question for Iranian and non-Iranian guests, and I'd like to be more realist. From the standpoint of the Islamic governments, considering the situation, all the difficulties, the social and political uprising and economic crisis that we have in the country, do you think that the Islamic government has got any other chance but continuing this nuclear issue? Thank you.
Would you repeat the question?
In fact, I'd like to see the problem from the standpoint of the government, the Islamic governments. Why they want to continue. Considering the situation in Iran, all these sort of difficulties that we have, the problem of the region and so on, do they have any other choice but continuing this nuclear program?
Mr. Mohsen Sazgar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have three questions. My first question goes to Fitzpatrick. As an Iranian politician, which his goal is democracy for Iran, I believe that nuclear option is really military option is really harmful for our project, which is democracy for Iran. How can we remove this option from the table?
Which option?
Military option.
How can we remove them?
Yeah, how we can remove military option. You mentioned that Israelis may attack Iran, they have military strike on October or September, I don't know.
7 September.
I know that it's useless. So how we can persuade the world, especially Israelis, that remove the military option from the table? My second question goes to Mr. اتولنگی. You mentioned about the three sides of a triangle: negotiation, sanctions, and human rights. Is there any possibility to have a specific sanctions based on human rights in Iran? At the same time, I think that it sends a very, very significant signal to regime of Iran, people of Iran, opposition groups, that besides to the sanctions against nuclear issue of Iran, there are specific sanctions for human rights. And my last question goes to Dr. Zade. What's your forecast for next step of Iran? How do you see that regime of Iran will behave? I know it's a difficult question, definitely difficult question, but especially that we know that the Revolutionary Guard, IRGC, is involved. Let me mention my private negotiation, better to say friendly speaking, with Condoleezza Rice recently. Dr. Rice told me that once at the last year of he was in the State Department, she told me that Mr. Mottaki, Foreign Minister of Iran, sent a message to the United States that we are ready to negotiate with the United States based on grand bargaining, nuclear issue, Iraq, Afghanistan, Hamas, all together. She said that while we were thinking about this message, less than 24 hours we received another message. This second message was from General Qasem Soleimani, the chief commander of both forces of Iran. And he sent a message that Mottaki has nothing to do with these items. He has no power, he has no authority on that. If you want to negotiate with Iran, you should negotiate with both forces. Of course, Dr. Rice told me that we didn't answer, none of them. I explained to her that Dr. Rice, Qasem Soleimani is right. Mottaki, Foreign Minister of Iran today, Salehi, they don't have any authority to negotiate about these issues. It goes to the revolutionary nuclear issue as well. She said that we know that. So, with this fact in mind, that even behind the leader, this is revolutionary guard, which controls the nuclear issue of Iran. How do you see the future, especially after the oil sanction, which limits the benefit of revolutionary guard more than any other institution in Iran?
Dr. Hossein.
I think there are three reasons that is bothering this program. The first one is to divert the attention of the national community from human rights inside to something outside all the atrocities in Iran. second reason is to
We can't hear.
As we have seen before, and the third one, as one mentioned, is about having a very strong insurance policy against foreign attacks. They think that North Korea was not attacked because it had the weapons that Afghanistan and Iraq were attacked because they lacked nuclear weapons. And therefore, they are determined to develop the bomb. As you know, technically they have all the equipment. And because the German government has so much used everything and every equipment they have against their own people and against the international community, it is likely that they will use the same power if they have to use weapons again against their own people and their leaders. Therefore, the Iranian people have to change the regime. In case the people in Iran cannot change the regime, then what will be the action of the international community?
Thank you. Quite deservingly, the last word was the Shehriar.
Yes, and the last one, I want to ask an exotic question from the panel. Exotic? Don't you find any common interest or an overlap of interests between USA and Iran to continue the conflict rather than to solve it? If you see the Americans would impose their international leadership to show their ability to lead the international community as a unity and to be in Middle East to cut the continentalism against globalization between the regional new powers as China, as Russia, as India. They need a conflict. And from the other side, Iran also needs a conflict to raise up its ranking in power and to establish his leadership in the Islamic world and to have the influence between the Muslim mass. Aren't there any common interests, and aren't this describe the dual character of the behavior of the Americans in this nuclear conflict? Thank you.
There's a handful of questions. What we're going to do is we will take turns by the same order as the presentation until we hit 3:30, when we'll try to bring Dr. Hans Bلیکس on, and then after his statement we will continue. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Very many good questions. I cannot do justice to all of the good questions. By the way, I meant to say in introduction that although I used to work for the US government, I no longer represent Washington, but I sometimes forget. I think the Islamic Republic, Dr. Ahi, wants a solution because they are under such enormous economic pressure. But what they want is a solution that preserves their nuclear weapons option. They want to have it both ways. And the West does not want them to have it both ways. And that's been the crux of the problem the entire time. Yes, they want a deterrence, as speakers have said. But this whole program has the aspect of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yes, it started in 1985 vis-a-vis Iraq. Well, Saddam is gone. That threat is gone. Now, just because you live in a neighborhood where people have nuclear weapons doesn't mean you need them yourselves. Otherwise, Ireland would need one because their two closest neighbors have nuclear weapons. The only reason Iran faces a threat today from the outside is because of its nuclear weapons program. If they didn't have a nuclear weapons program, we would all be talking about human rights exclusively, but we wouldn't be talking about a possible military attack. So what they see as a deterrent, yes, that's the way they see it, but it has become a self-fulfilling threat perception. Yes, I agree, Mr. Asadi, that Iran does have a different cost-benefit analysis. The purpose of sanctions is to try to change that analysis for them by putting pressure on the leadership to make Khamenei fear that inflationary pressure and disagreement of the people could challenge his hold on power. That's the purpose. And that would affect his cost-benefit analysis because his whole purpose is to stay in power. So anything that could threaten his hold on power is the leverage. And I think I agree with Dr. Otolenghi that human rights could be a part of this. Dr. Zade asked what progress is needed for Israel to believe that enough progress has been made. I don't know exactly, but I think if the three positions that the P5+1 asked for, stopping 20%, stopping fordo operations, dealing with the accumulation of 20% enriched uranium, this would give Israel reason not to attack. But what if it's only one of those three? Would it be reason enough for Israel not to attack? Would it be enough progress? It's hard to tell. Israel is very uneasy about negotiations that only focus on 20% and not this huge stockpile of 5%. I fear there will be no agreement at all, and then I think September, October would be a time frame for an attack. Somebody asked, could it be before the U.S. presidential election? Yes, absolutely. That's the time when Israel has a window of political opportunity, because during the U.S. presidential election, Obama cannot do forcefully anything to stop Israel. He can say, don't do it. He has been saying it to Israel all these years, don't do it. Your question, how can we prevent Israel from not doing it? Obama has been trying everything to calm Israel, to tell Israel, don't do it, we will take care of the problem. And I think this is the key. To tell Israel that it's not Israel's problem alone, it's we. It's other countries. We understand Israel's concerns and we want to alleviate this problem. I think only that can persuade them not to. But I totally understand your point and agree with it. Ms. Nahi has asked a question about what is the point of having talks if the West is exaggerating the program. With respect, I disagree with Dr. Bajat about this. I think the problem is well understood in the West. We have the evidence from the IAEA. Every quarter they tell us how far Iran has advanced. We have the evidence of the weaponization. So that aspect is not in question. The only question is, what is Iran's ultimate intention? And I agree with Dr. Bajat that it would be suicidal for Iran to use a nuclear weapon. But I'm not 100% sure that they might not use one by mistake. I mean, even the Soviet Union and the United States came very close to using a nuclear weapon by mistake in the Cuban Missile Crisis, by miscalculation. I'm not sure that Iran wouldn't give a nuclear weapon to Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps rogue commanders, like Pakistan's nuclear scientists gave nuclear technology to 3 countries. And that's what Israel is worried about. Has Iran made a decision not to make nuclear weapons? No, nobody knows that they've made a decision either way. There's no evidence that they made a decision not to go nuclear, except for the fatwa. And I thank you very much for pointing out that the fatwa can be changed. And because the fatwa is not written down, nobody knows exactly what it is. Is it a fatwa against use of nuclear weapons, against building them, against developing? Well, surely not developing, because they are developing all of the technology. Mr. Doman Galiz asked a question about Musavian's point that the whole purpose of the nuclear weapons is to have an insurance policy, and that if they were given an insurance, would that be enough? I can't imagine what kind of insurance the West could give to Iran that would be sufficient. If the West writes down on a piece of paper, we promise not to attack you, and gives the piece of paper, will that mean anything? Of course not. It's just a piece of paper. US presidents will change, policies could change, and Iran might do something else besides nuclear weapons that would cause an attack. So I don't know what assurance would be enough. So I disagree with Dr. Musavian. The question by Mr. Salemi, exactly correct about Russia. Russia benefits from continuing the status quo. With regard to Dr. Musavian's involvement in the Mykonos bombing, I don't know anything about that. I know that Dr. Musavian told me personally that he often was blindsided during negotiations. He was the negotiator, he was the spokesman, but he often didn't know the basis of what the Revolutionary Guards were doing. I was asked another question about the cleaning of Parchin. Obviously, Iran is trying to clean Parchin, so there would be no evidence of any nuclear experiment there. I don't know whether they can totally clean it, but it's obvious they are trying to clean it, and it's obvious to me that they conducted some experiments there. And it's another example of Iran failing to honor its international obligations. Dr. Mohsen Sazegar, your question, yes, I think I answered your question. And Dr. Hossein, I think, again, I agree with you that the purpose is insurance, deterrence against foreign attack. But I disagree with your point about North Korea. North Korea was not attacked in the last 40 years, despite many provocations, despite attacking a US airplane, despite capturing a US warship, despite killing 3 American soldiers with axes. Why? Because of geography. Because if we attack North Korea, they will attack Seoul. It's right on the border. So, Second Korean War. It's not because they had nuclear weapons. They didn't have nuclear weapons for most of these 40 years. Iran does not have such a hostage capital next door. Yes, but here's my prediction. I firmly believe that if Iran produces nuclear weapons, it will be known, because Iran cannot keep secrets. Because Western intelligence and your friends or somebody will tell. And if they cross the line to producing nuclear weapons, they will be attacked on that day. By not just Israel, but by the United States. So they won't have nuclear weapons. But they'll be attacked when they make the decision to cross the line. And that's why I think they won't do it. I think they know that, they won't do it. So I think they can be deterred. Okay, Dr. Shariat Madari asked, does the United States and Iran have a common interest in prolonging the conflict? With due respect, I strongly disagree. I think Iran and the United States have a common interest in finding a solution so that the people of both countries and in the region do not have to live under this threat of war. The United States is the global superpower. The United States does not need another conflict to maintain the superpower position. In fact, another conflict drains U.S. resources and the economy. The United States has been involved in too many conflicts in the Middle East, unnecessary conflicts. The United States wants to get out of this conflictual situation. President Obama, I firmly believe, wants very strongly to resolve this problem peacefully. I'm not sure what will happen after November if there's a different president. I don't predict he wants war, but I do know that one of Mitt Romney's advisors, John Bolton, who I used to work for, talks about war as the solution, and that worries me.
If the nuclear companies and Israel and the United States attack Iran, either they need nuclear facilities or if we see this for the change of the regime.
If Israel attacks alone, it will be against the nuclear facilities only because they have a limited number of aircraft and missiles. If the United States joins the attack, it will be directed against the IRGC facilities, the air defenses, the naval ports. But I don't think it will be directed for the purpose of toppling the regime. That would not be Obama's purpose, I believe.
When the West, for example, discussed Iran in the center of Iran cooperated with us, we try to open the other hand said it's about democracy and the Iranian movement. Do you think
the issue of intense interest to all of you is how much emphasis should the United States and the West give to the nuclear problem as opposed to the human rights problem? As a matter of American national security interests, it's the nuclear problem that threatens American national security. But as a matter of American ideals, and the human rights problem threatens American ideals. America would like Iran to change on both fronts. But the nuclear problem is the one that brings us close to the brink of war, and that's more immediately, it's the most immediate problem.
I was told to carry on validating this. I take advantage of the time and question. I wish I had a crystal ball in which to manage to see first who is in charge of Iran's conclusion or I do know that government is not in control of the Iran at least since years ago. Otherwise, the best man to deal with the job was Salehi, who is a pragmatic person, understanding the situation, and from technical point of view, the best man that the government of Iran under any circumstances have. But he has no say in Iranian affairs whatsoever. So the next man will be Mr. Khamenei, who is in control, seemingly in control of Iran's military program. But who are feeding him? Of course, strategies from Sepah Pastaran are largely feeding the leader and also his own office. And mix of these two, making decide what the next step will be.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to join you. I think that the media discussion about Iran today is very timely. The big issue has landed somewhat in the shade of the Syrian affair, but after the failures of the talks in Baghdad some time ago and the more recent talks in Moscow, I think it's of paramount importance that people devote thought to the possible solution of the Iranian question. And let me say from the very start that I am sympathize and the premise that it is desirable to persuade Iran to suspend enrichment and then expect assurance of supply of uranium fuel that it needs. However, I fear that Iran sees the current proposals as attempts by the rich world to deprive Iran of something they consider a right under the NPT, and that it belongs to them to enrich uranium. And I fear, and I suspect that the offers that we heard from Baghdad, from the peace side of one, namely that Iran could expect to be able to import spare parts for civilian airplanes, was not very much of a quid pro quo. The demands on the P5 of one were very strong, for stopping enrichment in general, and in particular to stop the 20% enrichment at the Fordo plant and limit any further enrichment to the Natanz plant, which is one that can be bombed while the Fordo cannot. So if that is all that the P5+1 has to offer, there's nothing about sanctions or alleviation of sanctions. I feel rather pessimistic about the short-term outlook, and hence fear an increase of tension. But there is another element, and that's the one that I have written about in a memorandum last spring, which I think is still relevant, and that is that towards the end of the year we expect that there will be a conference in Helsinki. Cannot be sure it will take place, but I think it has been prepared, and that this is the outcome of the latest NPT review conference that decided there would be a conference, UN conference, about the zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. Now, at present juncture, a zone free of nuclear weapons and of biological and chemical weapons is, of course, not satisfactory or sufficient. I mean, for Israel to contemplate such a zone under which it would have to do away with its nuclear weapons, and Iran is not affected, since they don't have nuclear weapons, would not really be a viable proposition. I think that if one, on the other hand, were to say that they agree that the conference is not simply to look at the weapons, but also about means of producing the weapons. And that applies then to fuel cycle installations, such as those that Iran has built up in an enrichment plant. Then it becomes much more interesting, because I think it's both Israel and Iran and other states like Saudi Arabia and Egypt in the Middle East would gain if they all to abandon both weapons of mass destruction and the capacity to make them, including the enrichment, for a long period of time, and with effective control, and with assurances of supply of nuclear fuel. I'm quite convinced that the Israeli Tel Aviv and Jerusalem would not have such an idea today. But the closer the Iranians come to the weapons-making capacity, and the more risky it will be that countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt would move in that direction. The more interesting I think it would sound for Israel. They might ask themselves how useful indeed are the weapons that they have stored, and they all know that they have stored. And would it not be able to sacrifice those and the reproductive capacity that they have? I'm sure they will not fight on that today, but because the strategy has been for Israel to destroy any massive capacity for production of weapons-grade material. They bombed the Iraq reactor before it could operate. They bombed the Syrian reactor long before it could operate. And they are been talking about bombing uranium installations. In the long run, however, it does not seem to me this is a viable way. Whereas the zone in which they would sacrifice their own capacity of doubtful use in return for others doing the same thing could be of great value. Now, it's not popular in the world to urge states to abstain from the capacity of enrichment and reprocessing, and I have no illusion that it would be impossible to modify the NPC in that direction, some people have suggested. But a zone in an area where the parties agree to do that is another matter. In fact, South Korea and North Korea in 1991 had a denuclearization agreement under which both agreed that they would stay away from enrichment and reprocessing. Now, that agreement fell apart, but nevertheless shows that states in the region can, if they find it useful, agree to such abandoning such capacity. Doesn't mean that they have to do it forever. They could make a suspension for, say, 25 years with the guarantees of supply. And then they should allow enrichment if they agree on it between themselves. But they certainly could take care of the situation for a good time to come. There is no lack of enrichment capacity in the world, so the Iranians could easily import the nuclear fuel they need for Bushehr, and the Abu Dhabi could import also, and any other country in the Middle East that went for nuclear power could certainly be able to import. Well, some people think it's a wide idea, and certainly thinking a bit outside the box. But I think that we need this, so I do not see any easy short-term fixes. The 20% enrichment, which was a useful avenue to start with, may still be of use in the short term. However, I think that the P5+1 will have to find more advertising quid pro quo than they have done so far, and I doubt that anything but a more radical and more imaginative and a more important quid pro quo like its own would be of interest. Let's remember that Iran and Egypt were the ones who once together advanced the idea of a nuclear weapons determinability.
Could you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Hans, thank you very much for joining us. Can you hear me? This is Mark Fitzpatrick. Hans?
Yeah, I hear you.
Thank you. If I could ask one question, I agree with your point that some sanctions relief will be necessary for Iran to compromise on its enrichment production. It's very difficult for President Obama during an election year to offer any sanctions relief. Do you, as a European, think that the EU could be in a position to give some relief on their sanctions, despite the hard line that France has taken on this position?
I don't hear this statement. I can hear you, but not this statement.
Can the European Union provide sanctions relief on its own?
Could you hear me better?
Yeah, I hear you, but I don't hear the question in the background.
Okay. The question by Mark Fitzpatrick is, we understand that the difficulties that the United States may have, but do you think as a European that the European Union is in a position to provide sanction relief as an inducement in the negotiation, given the hard line that France has taken?
Well, I think that once the European Union has landed on the sanctions, it is quite an apparatus to walk back from. I would agree with Mark that if such an offer were made, yes, that is something that would make an impression on the Iranians. But I doubt that it's realistic to get the Europeans. You would also then get a split between the Europeans and the United States. The U.S. remains very hard line, and I understand they must do that in the light of the presidential election. And even in the case of Syria, Syria's problem is also in part an Iranian problem. The U.S. and others, and Saudi Arabia, have an interest in the toppling of the Assad government because they hope to further isolate Iran. So they are really very tough engaged with Iran. And I doubt that the Europeans, even though Sarkozy has been succeeded by Hollande, and perhaps the new government is a little less dedicated than before. So I don't see that as a very hopeful way out. And I thought that in a way, as I hinted, the offer of the spare part civilian aspect was almost laughable as it is so cool. And when they also insist that there should be a stopping of activities at border, thereby leaving the implication that they might tolerate enrichment as a factory that can be bombed, but they will reject any activity or fact that cannot be bombed. Again, these are not propositions that I think one would very likely expect the Iranians to take. I don't know exactly how hard the sanctions will hit the Iranians. Maybe it is as crippling as the US hopes. But I think we are up against a state and a government that wants to be proud. It's a defiance in which they are engaged. They don't really need a risky Iranian. It's a defiance. And in defiance, I think they are willing to put up with a good deal of hardships. And therefore, I'm not optimistic on this.
That was a question from Fitzpatrick. The next question is from Dr. Zade.
Hello, Dr. Beliks. I wish you were here and we had a chance to have an even livelier debate and discussion over Iran's nuclear program with your presence. However, alas, we don't have that opportunity. I have two questions. One is not related to the points you have made today. Some people, I am not included, blaming you for becoming a bit liberal or even appeasement vis-à-vis the Islamic Republic of Iran concerning their nuclear program. What do you have to say to them with regards to your recent comments? My second question is about your little while ago an interview with Al Jazeera, during which you made very significant points and also tried to undermine the importance of the visit to Parchin that your successor, Mr. Amano, asked Iranian authorities to secure the permission for. And you said, I remember that because I reviewed your answer to that question, that the admission has been taking place in 2005 with two visits made to the place, and the Iranian government has no problem with it. My question is, if the implementation of the safeguards, which was your direct duty once, is periodical or is permanent, and the UN watchdog should have their observation in place all the time. And if they haven't done anything up to 2005, who can secure any guarantee that nothing has happened since 2005 and there is no need to have an immediate visit to the place?
Did you hear, Dr. Blake?
No.
Okay. Some people say that your overly dovish position vis-a-vis Iran actually helps the regime. How do you respond to them? Number two, in an interview in Al Jazeera, you understated the importance of a visit to Parchin. You said that 2005 they had paid a visit to Parchin, but the safeguard agreement requires continuous inspections, and if they don't have anything to hide, why are they preventing a visit now? Those are the two questions.
Yeah, well, my comments to the Iranians are usually that, why don't you accept the additional protocol, because you will be tested or you'll be pushed to accept inspections that really would fall under the additional protocol anyway. I mean, if they don't adhere to the protocol, you will say, we challenge you to open up Parchin or something else, and if you don't do that, then that suggests that you are hiding something. the Iranians had opened up marches earlier on, and I think that they were ready to set some sort of road map to further visits, but they were not willing to keep it open at the just at the will and the whim of the IEA. And that I understand that marching is a huge area with many hectares of things. And I don't think it's amazing that any country with a big, huge military establishment are not ready to open it as international inspection. I mean, after all, there was no talk about any production of nuclear material there. This doesn't mean that it's uninteresting, but I have the feeling that this demand for ever more information enters into an effort to make the Iranians look resistant and thereby look culpable. I think it's not. We need to think in more constructive ways than that. In fact, I don't think that anything will convince some of the P5 that Iran is not moving towards a bomb except scrapping or enrichment. And I agree that's the safety. I don't see that Iran has a need for enrichment. They can easily, at one time in the past, they were unable to import fuel for the research reactor. But I think the second time, they also that they had some Russians and others about import, or such that would have been reliable in the future. So I don't think that's the problem. I think the main problem remains defiance, remains pride, and that has to be handled in a psychological manner. And most of what we read in the Western press, not necessarily in Asia, but in the Western press, I think is heavily influenced by the chancelleries of the Western world.
Thank you, Mr. Belick. Thank you very much indeed. We'll let you enjoy the rest of the Saturday afternoon.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm glad if I had some cats onto the table there.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Time is the worst enemy. We only have 5 minutes left for all of the questions. So it's between Dr. Otolenghi and I think Mr. Tarizada and Dr. Tarizada and Dr. Otolenghi were next. I don't know how you want to take it. We only have 5 minutes.
We need 1.5 or at the most 2 minutes for my last comment, which is related to Mark question. I believe the Islamic Republic is not genuinely ready for the dialogue with the West, with the group.
We again have Could you please get closer or?
Okay. Maybe I can increase the volume this way.
No, that's fine. No, that's fine.
I don't believe, I can't understand if they are genuine with the readiness to initiate talk and negotiate with the West over the program, because they are not in a critical position as yet. But I do believe they are trapped and they are still confused. When I mention to them is the Iranian government, of course, or the ruling parties or whoever are in charge of the country and the political system. And they do not know what to do. They do not have a roadmap themselves. They want to negotiate over the terms, but still they don't know what the terms are suiting their purpose. If they were actually genuinely interested to conduct a constructive dialogue, why on earth should they avoid the United States participants? Why should they avoid talking directly to them? They do know the final arbiter are the United States of America. They should say what way this development could take. And if they are avoiding them, it means they are not genuine. But I do see
In the future, which I do not know when this future will be, I repeat Mr. Wilson's, the previous Prime Minister of Britain, that 1 week in politics is a long time. Mark made a couple of references to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the negotiation with them, and we have witnessed what happened in Tunisia and to the rest of North African countries within a few months. Who could say what would happen next in the next 12 months or so in Iran? Actually, no one could say even what would happen before the US election. So Iranians are baffled, puzzled, to a degree confused, with no roadmap themselves, but they are interested to continue the situation before they regain their consciousness, before to come to a sort of conclusion themselves inside Iran and know what are the real terms that could serve their benefits. But they understand they are not in as strong a position as they were 5 years ago.
Thank you. So many questions, so little time. So I'm going to try and address some of the points that were raised by this audience. I want to also thank you because they were all brilliant insights and comments and questions. First, I agree that Iran does cost and benefit analysis, but I think we in the West misunderstand what is the cost and what is the benefit of Iran. Since I am Italian by birth and we use in our culture as many flowery expressions and metaphors as you do in Iranian culture, I want to tell you a story to make that clear. There's two madmen who live in a high security mental institution, surrounded by 100 walls, and they want to escape. So they train for years. And one night, they feel that physically now they are prepared. So they start jumping walls, and because they did this together, they're bound to each other, and they say to each other, if you are tired, I'm prepared to go back with you. So they jump 10 walls. Are you tired? No. 20 walls. Are you tired? No. 30 walls. Are you tired? No. 50 walls. Are you tired? No. 99 walls. Are you tired? Yes. Let's go back then. Now, Iran is at the 99th wall. We don't understand that, but that's where they are. Maybe 98 or 97. But that's how far they've gone. So in a purely rational cost and benefit analysis, to give up 30 years of financial, political, economic sacrifices when they're within reach of the goal, just to get what we are prepared to offer them, which is, yes, economic benefits, lifting sanctions, security guarantees, etc., all things which in the long term may undermine the survival of the regime. Why should they take it? The ladies asked over there if why do they continue the nuclear program? Is there any other choice they have? The answer is that we have given them the opportunity of choosing other paths many times. Somebody mentioned the grand bargain. We have offered them the grand bargain in 2006, in 2008. The text of the grand bargain now is part of UN Security Council Resolution 1929. It's there. They said no. They said maybe we'll think about it, we'll come back. They sent one envoy, then another message. They said no. So the option was offered, is that the regime, in my view, cannot take it. So the question is, how do we avoid a crisis? And I think that was the question of Dr. Sazegaran. My answer is, and again, forgive for being so blunt and direct, the best way to avoid a military showdown with Iran on the nuclear issue is to change the regime. If you have a different regime in Iran, the problem will be solved in a different way. I mean, again, I do not imagine that Iran, under a new regime, will give up its nuclear program. But I would suspect that it would want to win over recognition by the international community.
We'll give it all up.
Okay, you'll give it all up, but whoever else would want to come through and come clean of this issue. So a new regime that doesn't pose a threat to the region, and that is transparent and respectful of international obligations would be the way forward. I think that it is in our power as Western countries and societies to do something, not much. Again, we do have in the books already a number of very limited human rights-based sanctions. They were passed, all of them, after 2009. Right now we have listed individuals who were directly responsible for repression inside the country, limited their ability to travel and frozen their assets abroad, which is more symbolic than anything else. And we have limited or prohibited the export of technology that is directly involved in repression. However, we have a precedent in EU legislation, by the way. The European Union adopted many years ago a package of sanctions against the Republic of Myanmar, Burma. Those sanctions were not targeting proliferation or drugs or anything that the regime was or wasn't involved in doing. What they did was the following. They said the regime controls large sectors of the economy. The revenues from these activities sustain the regime and enable it to survive. We will go after any business endeavor that the regime is involved in. And that would be a way forward. It's not about gas and oil or proliferation. It's about whether, if this glass is produced by the Revolutionary Guards, we should sanction it. If this pen is produced by the Revolutionary Guards, we should sanction it. That's one way forward. The second point is, again, Iran desires international recognition. Many people here today mentioned it. Deny them that recognition by isolating them in international forum. You mentioned the question of consulates and embassies. Rather than closing their embassies, first of all, I would like to limit the amount of diplomats they have and restrict the freedoms they have in operating in Western countries. The second thing that I would like to do is what they do to us in Iran. If you go to Iran, you have Khaled Islambouli Avenue, and you have you have Che Guevara Street, and so on. I want, and this is something you can organize in your own countries by political activism. Ask municipalities where consulates and embassies are located to rename the street where the Iranian consulate or embassy is after an Iranian freedom martyr or a dissident. I proposed 3 years ago to name all those streets after Neda Sultan. Do it. It's not, it's not going to bring the regime down. It is not going to stop the march to nuclear weapons. But it will undermine the legitimacy of the regime. It will erode support for them. It will shame them and humiliate. Every time Ahmadinejad travels to a summit somewhere in Brazil, in Switzerland, our Western leaders should refuse to meet him. His delegation should be shrunk to the minimum acceptable. These are things that can be done. In addition to that, a lot of legislation can be passed to restrict, to target the families of the regime. Why are the children of the regime allowed to get easily visas to study in the West when decent, ordinary Iranians are denied the right to free education in Iran and cannot get visas to the West? That's another thing that can be done. So the list is extremely long. If you're interested in the details, buy my book on sanctions. And it will have
well, seriously at the time, Mr. Bayard, please.
I wanted to speak. Because of the time, because the time is too short, I will go to 2 questions. One of them was the question of Parchi. IAEA is an important organization. The impartiality and credibility of IAEA is very important to be maintained. But if you look at the statements IAEA did concerning Parchi, it gives rise to create the doubts about this credibility, because I'm telling you as a physicist who are familiar with the problem. If Islamic Republic, if the regime of Islamic Republic has done experiments with nuclear materials, it is almost impossible to remove it. It is not possible. If you look at the news, they say they have destroyed buildings and they have transported the trashes to the other side of the camp. You know, that it means these are allegations which are not, which are nonsense, are absurd, and I think it is bad for such an organization to take these facts as its own. That is important. I don't want to say Iran didn't do, our Islamic the regime of Iran didn't do anything there, you know. But if it has done something, it cannot remove it, you know. So first point. Second point, I told that the crippling sanctions, especially the crippling sanctions, you know, the other sanctions, the smart sanctions, the sanctions concerning the politically isolating Iran, the sanctions concerning promoting the human rights, which is the main concern of the regime. This part should be intensified, but the crippling sanctions, insofar as it doesn't have an exit strategy, but the war are not proper, you know. And so that is why I told either the war prospect should take off the table and continue maybe with crippling, or the West should be patient, like in Southern Africa, that is South Africa, should be patient with continuing to sanction smartly the regime and promoting the democratic movement of Iran. We don't want a regime change from outside. We would very much like to change the regime from inside, you know? And that is what we expect. We expect from international community support, of course, but we don't want that soldiers from outside come in and liberate us, you know, because we have seen the results how it was in Iraq. So, due to the time, I thank you very much, and I finish my statement.
I want to thank the panel. Mark Fitzpatrick had to leave
There was one last question there. Does any member of the panel have any information about the new sanctions Americans have decided upon, that is sea blockade and...
No, unfortunately, we don't have time for it. The boss sitting there says that Mark Fitzpatrick had to leave to catch a train. We thank him. We thank Dr. Otolenghi, Dr. Zade, Dr. Biat very much, and thank you all so much for participating. Thank you.